This episode of Coronavirus North Carolina News Brief is brought to you by Right By You Mortgage. Wherever life takes you, we're right by you. Visit rightbyyoumortgage.com/podcast to learn more. Hey, before we begin, just a heads up. Today's episode of the News Brief was pre-recorded. For breaking news about the coronavirus, go to WRAL.com. From WRAL News and the Capital Broadcasting Podcast Network, this is your Coronavirus North Carolina News Brief for Friday, September 11th, 2020. I'm Cliff Baumgardner. Unprecedented. It's a phrase you've probably heard a lot since the pandemic began. You might even be tired of hearing it. But it does seem to sum up the often strange, uncomfortable experiences and way of life we've all had to adapt to in recent months. But the thing is, while we've never experienced something quite like COVID-19 before, we have dealt with pandemics in the past. Throughout history and all over the world, people have grappled with plagues, flus, and other illnesses that have required them to do many of the things we are now, like wearing masks and self-isolating. And most importantly, people adapted to those times and used their experiences to write the rulebook we're now following in our own battles with the virus. So, as any history teacher will tell you, if we want to understand our world today, it's worth looking back at where we came from. Recently, WRAL's Debra spoke to Dorsey Armstrong, a professor from Purdue University, about the lessons we can learn from how the entire world responded to the deadliest pandemic in history, the bubonic plague.
So let's start with the parallels between the current COVID-19 pandemic and the 14th century pandemic. How are they similar and how are they different?
Well, one thing we can say for sure is that no matter how far in the past we look, humans then and humans now tend to react in a variety of ways that are very similar. So, for example, we had people in the 14th century turning to despair. Some people chose to try and deny that the pandemic was happening and just sort of go on with their lives. There was a lot of panic. There was a lot of fear, a lot of turning to religion. And there was, unfortunately, a lot of scapegoating of minority populations because no one could explain where this disease had come from, and they were looking for any explanation possible. And we've seen some of that with this pandemic as well.
Boy, millions and millions of people died back then. What lessons from the Black Death could we apply to the current situation?
I would say one thing that is encouraging is to know that humanity has survived worse pandemics than the coronavirus, at least as it stands right now. Mortality rate for the Black Death, if one contracted the disease, was something like 80%. And yet, amidst all this chaos, many communities managed to implement better hygiene regulations, to create a quarantine. That's where we get our word quarantine, is from the Black Death. Before ships could put into port, if they were coming from an area that had been infected, they had to wait on an island offshore for 40 days. And so medieval people put into practice many of the things that we're doing today, and they did have some positive effect in slowing or at least controlling the disease.
It is interesting to see how we have all kind of taken on some of those things, like especially the better hygiene right now. What parts of that medieval society were most impacted by the plague?
So here's the thing about this pandemic in the 14th century is that all of society was impacted by the plague. And it's been typical to discuss it as a phenomenon that occurs primarily in medieval Europe. But really, as we start to look at more evidence, it really was a global pandemic. And we see evidence in Asia, in Africa, possibly. And so it was much more widespread than we maybe initially thought. And its devastation was such that we may not even know the full extent because the people who would have recorded that devastation didn't survive to do so, and nor did anyone around them. So it was a terrifying situation. All of society was affected. And in many cases, the people who survived the plague ended up better off than they were before, as horrible as the experience had been. Now, in some other cases, the losses and the devastation were truly staggering. Whole communities were gone. Certain types of knowledge that had been passed on by artisans were lost. So there were positives and negatives, but it's safe to say every corner of society was touched.
Well, I think we can always learn from history, and hopefully we will learn this time around too. Dr. Dorsey Armstrong, Duke PhD graduate and English department head at Purdue University, thank you so much for your time and insight, especially on this holiday.
It's my pleasure. Thank you for having me.
And anyone interested in learning more about this topic can sign up for your class, The Black Death, on thegreatcourses.com.
This has been your Coronavirus North Carolina News Brief for Friday, September 11th, 2020. As always, if you enjoy the news and information you get from this show, let us know. Leave a rating and review wherever it is you listen. Plus, while you're there, don't forget to hit subscribe so you don't miss our new episodes. Thanks for listening. When it comes to buying a new home, you want to know that you're in good hands. At Right By You Mortgage, the dedicated team of lenders live in your community and are committed to being right by you every step of the way. Whether you're a growing family, a relocating professional, or a retiring couple, they'll partner with you to find the right loan to fit your unique home buying needs. Plus, with the Right By You Mortgage on-time closing guarantee, they'll pay you and the seller $500 if you don't close on time. Visit rightbyyoumortgage.com/podcast to get started. Wherever life takes you, we're right by you. Go to rightbyyoumortgage.com/podcast for full details. Equal housing lender, NMLS number 402136.